Thank you, Francisco, for agreeing to do this interview. Today is April 14th, 2014, and we are at the library of the Institute for Latino Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Just to get started, can you state the date of your birth, where you were born, where you grew up, and where you spent your childhood?
Very good. I'm very happy to be here in Notre Dame, and I came last time, I think, 12 years ago. And I was born in Wilmington, California, in February 21st, 1954. My mother was also born in Wilmington, California, and they had arrived in 1919. They were the founders of the barrio of Wilmington. And then when I was 6 years old, my family moved to Guadalajara because my father wanted for us to meet our grandparents, and I was very happy and very honored to meet my grandmother, especially on my father's side, who was a Nahuatl traditional woman. And I became totally influenced by her, and also I think her favorite grandson. And so I used to come back to visit my grandmother, my great-grandmother in LA, and they live in Wilmington, and then they left. And after that, and so, and then in 1977, I came back to live in the States because my family had a collapse, an economic collapse, because my father basically lost everything in card games. And so I came by myself to LA, and that's how I started my life in this country again.
Could you say a little bit about what life was like as a child in Guadalajara? Any memories? Or?
Well, I have interesting memories from Wilmington.
Okay.
Wilmington, California, in that we used to live around just behind the church that my family actually had founded in 1928. And I used to, so for me, going to church was something that was very familiar. Now, this is a church, and my family had bought the land. They wanted to establish a church for Mexicans because they felt discriminated against in Wilmington, and so they actually brought a priest that was from Mexico because they had a Cristiada in Mexico, a civil war in Jalisco, and the bishop was against that. The bishop was not allowing to have another church for Mexicans and women. But my family, they didn't stand for that, so they did it. So in Guadalajara, it was difficult the first years. Let me tell you this: when we arrived, we had a lot of problems because we were Chicanos, we were Pochos, we didn't speak proper Spanish, and we had a lot of fights. And so it was my grandma who took us, from school. Because we were coming home, bleeding, and so
you were bullied. You were basically
bullied. Boys. I was the first grade, I'm the third in a family of 7, and so they took us from school, and my grandfather and my grandmother taught us how to read and how to write in Spanish. And so to me, I have a very good memory that my own family taught us what my grandfather used to say, las llaves del universo.
So education was very important in your household.
Totally. And so my father said to us, my grandfather, these are the keys to the universe. And so once we learned how to write and read in Spanish, we went back to school and we were able to do that. And then later on, I went to a Jesuit high school.
In
Guadalajara. So I went to, I think it was the best school in the city, very prestigious. And my father had gone to that high school.
Do you remember the name of it?
Instituto de Ciencias. Instituto de Ciencias, and I really thrived in that school. I became like the literary editor of a magazine that was published in the high school.
So even as early as high school, you began to get interested in literature.
Oh yeah, in poetry and literature, and they had a fantastic library. They had 40,000 volumes of Mexican literature, and I was the keeper of the key because it was an honor to be there. This is a special library of Mexican literature, and I was the librarian. They had a room, a huge room, and I was the one that could spend any time I could go to the library, do everything I wanted to do.
So just to make sure we're clear, so your high school years, all 4 high school years were in Guadalajara, Mexico.
And then in 1977 I came, and 1972 I came to Los Angeles. And so what I did, I went to my first quarter. It was hard because I had no money basically, and I had to work, and I had different jobs, and so I went to a community college, East LA Community College, for the first quarter.
Okay.
And then after the first quarter, my professor, there was a professor, was very supportive of me and said, Francisco, you should move to, not stay here, move to another university. Because I was turning my papers, and so
He noticed something in your work.
noticed, and he was actually, and he's the one that said, why don't you apply to Long Beach State, and transfer to Long Beach State. So I did.
Okay.
I transferred to Long Beach State, and so I got my degree in history and Spanish, and I became again editor of a literary magazine called El Alba. El Alba. And so, and when I was there, it must have been, I think, in 1976 or so, we were doing an event for Chile to commemorate the government and the coup d'etat that was so sad. And so we had a big event. I remember there were hundreds of people. And I was one of the organizers of the event, and I was one of the poets. So I read in public poetry, and at the end of the event, Fernando Alegría, who was the cult attaché of the Allende government in Washington, and who was a very important literary leader, I think, in terms of Chilean letters, he basically came to me and said, Francisco, have you considered applying to Stanford? And I said, no, I haven't. And he said, well, please apply to Stanford. And so I did apply to Stanford University, and then to also UCLA and UC Berkeley, and I was very happy that I got a letter from Stanford saying that I was accepted.
So it was Fernando Alegría who prompted you to apply to Stanford.
And I think that's the gift of mentorship. The idea that I think it is important for people to have mentors. And so he became a mentor.
Who was the name? I'm glad you mentioned mentorship, because that's one of the areas that I'm interested in touching upon. You mentioned the mentor you had at East LA Community College. Do you remember his name?
No, I remember. I remember that.
The person who encouraged you to go to Long Beach State.
It was an English professor. It was Chicano. Grijalva was his last name. Professor Grijalva.
Okay.
And so he was the one that immediately said, Francisco, you should continue. You should transfer to a state college, and that's what I did. And then Fernando Alegría became my mentor
at Stanford. What about at Long Beach State? Any mentors?
At Long Beach State, it was interesting. I had a Jack Schmidt, was the professor of Spanish, an Anglo professor, was a wonderful person, and he basically encouraged me to study Portuguese. And so I learned Portuguese, and I was writing actually poems in Portuguese, and I really was totally influenced by Brazilian literature. I was still Guimarães Rosa, an incredible writer, and I read all his books in Portuguese, and I went to UC Santa Barbara, and actually, I studied Portuguese, and I think I was going to become a Portuguese professor at one point.
Let's get back to Stanford for a moment, and I'd like you to talk to me about Stanford and see if you can address the following issues, because I know that my understanding is that Stanford was a very fruitful time for you. So tell us about who were some of the writers you met at Stanford, name who they are, and how being in that community at Stanford influenced your writing and your career afterwards.
Well, the first day that I got to Stanford, I was very happy that I put my things away in the apartment that I was sharing with a person from Iran, an engineer, and I ran to the International House because they were having a reception. And so the first person that I saw as I entered the International House was another Chicano that was looking at me and I was looking at him, and I went and I introduced myself, and he came to me too, and so that was Juan Felipe Herrera. And later on, people told us...
So just to make sure we're clear.
That was 1977.
1977.
In September.
Okay.
That was 1977.
Okay.
That was the first day I was at Stanford.
So was Juan Felipe the first Chicano writer you met?
No, I had met people before,
Okay.
but
I mean at Stanford.
At Stanford, of course. That was
Yeah.
the first person.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
was the first day.
Okay.
And we hit it on, and it was wonderful. And later on, some other Chicanos said to us, "Why did you go to the International House? That was for international students." I said, "Well, we're international." That was, I totally agree with that idea that we didn't have to be limited,
Yeah.
to the barrio, to the ghetto. And so then immediately we hooked with the writers around. There was a wonderful group of writers. Jose Antonio Burciaga used to have a tertulia. At Tertulia, it was a gathering of writers, and the people like Lucha Corpi, Gary Soto, Lorna Di Cervantes,
But these were
Bernice
just
Samora. These people that were been at Stanford already, and that area, and they used to meet. They used to have monthly gatherings with food and discussing and readings. We used to get together at Jose Antonio Burciaga's home.
and so Burciaga was a student or a professor?
No, he
there?
was Cecilia Burciaga was a provost at Stanford. He and provost for Latino affairs, it was called, and he was an artist. Then he became the resident fellow of Casa Zapata. They moved on campus.
Yeah.
Casa Zapata was like the theme house for Chicanos,
Yeah.
and very influential. So I really got to meet a lot of the people that I admired later on, and it was important for us to get together. And then with Lorna Di Cervantes, we used to go to her press in San Jose, and it was very active. This was a group that we were doing readings, we were doing conferences, we were doing a lot of things together.
But just to make sure we get the facts correct, so I want to make sure I understand you correctly. So you mentioned, I know that Lorna Di Cervantes and Gary Soto were certainly part of that scene in the Bay Area, but I think I also Benjamin Alira Sanz was also at Stanford.
Much later.
Much later. Okay.
This is
But
another generation.
Gary and Lorna, they were. Are you saying that Gary and Lorna were students at Stanford?
No.
No.
We
Okay,
used to.
let's
Let's
make
say,
sure. Yeah.
The Jose Antonio Burciaga was basically the person that was inviting
Okay.
all the writers to
Okay,
his
so-
home.
so what you're saying
That's
then-
how. And another person that was
Yeah.
also very important was Bernice Samora, a poet.
And she was at Stanford.
She was at Stanford.
Okay, so-
And then also Javier Pacheco, a musician that was not at Stanford, but actually very much involved with this. And then Francisco Santana, a poet that was also at Stanford.
He was
in
at
the department,
Stanford.
yes.
Okay.
And then later on, a year later, Gloria Velasquez got to Stanford, and she also got involved with this group. And then we used to also visit Jose Montoya. And so this group was, we went, I remember as a group, we went to Sacramento,
Yeah.
to Otro Canto at the Reno Club. And that's how I met a lot of the writers also in the California setting.
Yeah.
And so it was a very active.
And so, just getting back to a little bit to Jose Antonio Burciaga, so would it be fair to say that he was sort of the person at that time who tried to convene a community?
Precisely. And like I said, we used to have a lot of readings. I remember the Floricantos at Stanford, and they were readings that maybe had at one point 30, 35, 40 poets reading with music, and we started at 6 o'clock and we were 2 o'clock in the morning. It's still
And
at Casa Zapata.
And who were some of the poets you remember who took part in those readings?
Well, like I said, Juan Felipe Herrera, Gary Soto, Lorna Di Cervantes, Bernice Samora, also Orlando Ramirez was a poet for San Jose,
okay.
who went to Yale University. Also Jose Saldívar, who is now
Who later
professor,
became a critic, right?
critic,
Yeah.
but he
But he
was
started
writing
as
poetry.
he started as a poet.
He was
Okay.
writing poetry too. And Victor Martinez,
he was at Stanford.
He was at Stanford. Sackler Fellow.
So just to get this straight thing, because I think this is important. It's important to so Stanford then at that time had a number of writers. So it was yourself, Juan Felipe Herrera, Bernice Samora, Victor Martinez, Francisco Santana.
And Gloria Velasquez.
Gloria Velasquez,
and so there were a bunch of us.
What were you studying at Stanford? What
I was studying in Spanish. I was in the Spanish department, and then I became editor of El Vórtice,
Tell
Vortice
us about
became
Vortice.
the literary magazine. We actually got lots of money. I mean, I remember that we got $1,500. That was a lot of money.
Wow, that's a lot of money back
That
then.
was a lot of money. And so to do our, and we did beautiful.
How many numbers do you remember? How many
I
numbers
remember.
you
I think we
published?
did about four numbers when we were there,
And all these writers you've mentioned were...
and then we have exchanges with magazines, and that was a booming time, because I remember that we had 800 different magazines that we had contacts, and we had basically exchanges. Poets and writers from all over the world, not just Latinos, but also they were people like, well, you have Mango Press, Pajarito Publications from New Mexico, Mestizo, Tejidos, also, and then you have, Caracol from San Antonio. It was a tremendous boom of Latino literary journals.
What do you
taking
remember?
place.
What do you remember? Because my recollection is that right around this time, late 70s, was when Gary Soto started the Chicano chapbook series, which included, I think, Orlando Ramirez
And Victor Martinez,
and
Sandra Cisneros also.
yeah.
Actually, that was the first chapbook that was done by Sandra. And that was the first
Bad
chapter.
Boys, I think it was called.
That's right.
Bad Boys.
And that was published by Mango Press.
So the Chicano chapbook series was just one, because these other magazines that you've mentioned I'd never heard before. It's interesting.
Oh, no,
so it sounds like the Chicano chapbook series was not the only show in town. There were a number of other ones.
But others in the Southwest, it was. There was
But Vortices was at Stanford.
There was a Stanford, of course, but that was more an academic publication.
Okay.
And it included poetry also, and we did publish poets like Raúl Salinas.
In Vortices?
In Vortices, of course.
Okay.
And Juan Felipe became, co-editor of that magazine, of Vortices.
So you and Juan Felipe were co-editors of Vortices.
Yes,
Okay.
that's and it was I think a wonderful project that we had.
When did your involvement with Vortices conclude?
Well, I think what happened there was a little coup d'état, because I think we were very active and we were doing a lot of things, and then all the graduate students somehow felt that we Chicanos had taken control of the literary project. And so we had a coup d'état. The board decided that we were taking too much, and so we were basically that was it. And so they took control, and the magazine didn't go anywhere. But that was for us was important. And also what was important for us is that then we formalized this as the Chicano Latino Writer Center. And Lucha Corpi.
At Stanford?
No, this was outside.
Okay.
But this was a center that we wanted to basically promote Chicano Latino writers. And we got monies from the California Arts Council to basically go to communities and do readings, communities that never had opportunity
And
readings.
who were the people in leadership positions in that
Well,
center?
Lucha Corpi was one of the presidents. Roberta Fernandez was actually, I think, the founder. He was a writer also from the Bay Area. And then Ana Castillo got involved with this project too. And also Juan Felipe was part of that too. Yes. And
what was the mission of the center?
well, that was to promote Latino, Chicano Latino literature in the
And
community.
even in that period of time, you were using both expressions, Chicano and Latino?
No, we started with Chicano.
Okay.
And then as the community became more diversified, there was a writer, Martibón Galindo, for example, who was from El Salvador, and she became very active in the group. And so she said, why don't we change the name from Chicano Latino? So we would be Chicano/Latino Writer Center. And we decided to do that.
And how was so that suggestion was accepted?
Of course, and this was
Well, not
early-
necessarily, of course.
No, but that was for us. In the Bay Area, yes, you have to be in the Bay Area because we have a huge community of Salvadoreños, of Nicaraguenses, Guatemaltecos, and so there was no argument for that.
Okay, so
Other communities are more nationalistic.
So this is an important point. I want to make sure I have this clear. So it sounds like what you're saying then, that in terms of Chicanismo, in the Bay Area, because of the large Central American population, there was a tendency to be more inclusive, and there was no problem with having Chicano Latino.
Because what we decided to do, and I think, Tomás Ibarra Frausto, who basically was
Who
my
was
mentor.
who was at Stanford?
Stanford
Yeah.
was my mentor. He moved to San Francisco, and so I used to visit him at his house, and then also Arturo Islas, had
Who
a
was also-
house
who was also
at
at Stanford,
Stanford,
yeah.
had a house and a beautiful house in the Mission District in San Francisco. So we used to go to his house, and then so we decided to move. I think Juan Felipe and I decided after 1 year at Stanford, we moved to the Mission District, and that was to us another university, maybe the most interesting university.
What year was that?
This must have been in '78, a year after we were at Stanford.
So a year before the Sandinista Revolution.
Yes, and so
Okay.
there we become, the Mission Culture Center had just been founded in '77, and so the Sandinista was happening, and we were involved in different things there, going to readings in support of
So-
this, and so in '79 there was a big explosion, of course, when the Sandinista,
Yeah.
and then Ernesto Carnal came to the Mission Culture Center. Yes,
What year?
right. I think it must have been, a year or two after the Sandinista.
So
And
1980, 81.
And then they had, I think it was 1981, they had the Rubén Darío, the International Rubén Darío Poetry Prize, organized by the Sandinista government.
Okay.
In the Mission.
Yeah.
And they called for people to come in, and there were a lot of people, and
Yeah.
and it was it was a big gathering. I remember in the high school, and nobody knew who the winner was. Basically, we were there in the high school, and Fernando Alegría was one of the judges. Alejandro Muriga was another judge. Now he's the poet laureate of San Francisco. And so they announced, the winners, and then after like three different winners in terms of the first prize goes
Yeah.
to Francisco Alarcón.
Was it for a poem, a group of
A
poems?
group of poems.
A group of poems.
So,
And those poems that won that prize, were those the poems that ended up going into tattoos?
yes, that's right. That's right.
Okay.
So I was so happy with that. At the same time, we were very much involved with the Roquedato Culture Brigade.
Tell us about that.
This is a group of writers, Chicano and Anglo writers, that wanted to put a face to the struggle, because I think we were at that point.
When you say the struggle, what are you referring to?
Well, the struggle of liberation in Latin America,
Okay.
and the war that we had against the Sandinista, because Ronald Reagan came to power, and we had the Contras, fighting the Sandinistas,
Yeah.
and then we had El Salvador, the horrible civil war.
So on the
people
one
were
hand,
dying.
you have the Sandinista, the solidarity movement with the Sandinistas, but then also
El Salvador,
El Salvador.
El Salvador, it was when they killed Monsignor Romero in March 24th of 1980. That was to us, a waking call. And so we formed the Roquedato Culture Brigade. We called it Roquedato Culture Brigade because he was a wonderful poet who had been killed
Yeah.
by his own camaradas.
Oh, really?
And so it was a little bit controversial,
Yeah.
Even the name. But we did a book, still in print, Volcano, Central American writing in translation,
Edited by
Alejandro Murguía and Jack Hirschman,
Yes.
and also Barbara Paschke and David Bopendesta.
I know that
And
book.
I became also an editor and a translator. And then I was the editor and translator of Autor René Castillo, a Guatemalan poet, a book called Tomorrow Triumphant. And then Jack Hirschman also translated Poemas Clandestinos
Yeah.
by Roque Dalton.
So-
So it was important to do this, to put a human face to what was taking place in Central America.
So during this time, it sounds like from all this activity, there was no division between creating art and literature and political engagement. They both seem to be going hand in hand.
Precisely. And I think this is the big lesson, I think, of Latin America. And in Latin America, writing poetry it was a dangerous enterprise. And Roque Dalton died. Autor René Castillo was killed also when he was in the early 30s. And he was actually captured by the military, and he was set afire alive. And a lot of the poets were in exile in El Salvador. So for us, it was crucial and very important to do this. And my own writing also was affected by this struggle.
Let's get back to your writing for a minute, and I'd like to make sure that we understand. Could you talk a little bit about your first publications? Because I know that was Tattoos your first collection?
Yeah, that Tattoos.
Tell us about Tattoos.
Well, Tattoos came out. I was writing Tattoos at Stanford, and I took a course in career writing with Arturo Islas. And I remember that people were writing long poems and narrative poems, and I was doing short pieces. And so at the end of the quarter, we had to turn in a manuscript, a collection. So I remember that I made an appointment to see Arturo Islas. I went to his office, and I had turned in my collection, and he was very disappointed. He said to me, Francisco, these are not poems. What have you done the whole quarter? And I said, well, I wrote Tattoos. And I remember, and he said, but they're not poems. And I said, well, read the first one. And the first one was called Tattoos. It said, poems fill out pages, tattoos punch your flesh.
One more time.
It says, tattoos. It says, poems fill up pages, tattoos punch your flesh. And so the idea was, a tattoo, flags. It says, banderas, trapos imbéciles, empapados de sangre. Flags, stupid rags, soaked in blood. And so the idea was short and, of course, in turmoil. I didn't want to call it haikus, because haiku belongs to the Japanese tradition of peace with the environment and the nature. And a tattoo, it was more of a Chicano thing, and it was also indigenous in your skin. And it also involves the issue of commitment to your own writing. When you write on your skin, you have to be limited, because your skin is very limited. You cannot write long poems as a tattoo. So that was my leitmotif.
Where did that idea come from?
I have no idea, but I think I was doing with this in my mind. Short is less, and I think, and that's I got the Rubén Darío Literary Prize for that one, for Tattoos, and then I sent it to the Chicano Literary Prize of 1984 and got first prize also, and then it was my first book, and so I was.
Who published it?
It was a project done by a student, a friend of Barbara Pineda. Barbara Pineda was also a member of the Grupo de Escritores, and she was studying at Mills College, and this wonderful person was doing a master, an MA in bookmaking. And so the project that she chose was my collection, and she did a beautiful collection, Japanese style.
And
with
how many tattoos were in the collection, more or less?
I think it was a short collection. It must have been maybe 25 to 30 poems. In that one, it was the collection was larger. They won the prize, but in the Chicano Literary Prize. But since you wanted to do a short, very short, we selected this. So
just for the record, then.
So that was at 85. For
the record, then. Tattoos was your first collection of poems.
It came out. I remember they came out as a project, and then on the same year, Juan Felipe. Wanted to basically encourage us. We had a group of writers. We call it Los Ocho. And
Los Ocho.
Los Ocho.
Who
and
were
it was Juan Felipe Herrera, Victor Martinez, Juan Pablo Gutierrez, Rodrigo Reyes, myself, and they were. I think there must have been another three that I don't recall at this moment. But we call ourselves Los Ocho. And so we were dealing with sexuality, we were dealing with other things, because I had come from Mexico, and I wanted to start a group with hombres to talk about different things. And so out of that came out the idea of doing a collection of poetry that would be the first homoerotic collection of poetry.
And that was?
Ya vas, carnal. And the title comes from a poem by Rodrigo Reyes, who was a playwright, director of the Mission Culture Center, and very open. He was the founder of the first Latino Gay Alliance and Gala, and that was the first group ever in America.
Just a brief interruption here. Was this before or after you met Elias Nandino?
No, this was after.
Okay.
That's why I
So
said.
let's interrupt this for a moment. So we want to make sure we get that story in,
Okay.
because right now I think you're telling us the fruits of that meeting. So let's back up a little bit and tell us about that trip to Mexico City, Elias Nandino, and the significance of that meeting.
Well,
Tell us about
see, I think it really comes.
Give us the year, when you went.
It comes. We get together. Lucha Corpi, Juan Pablo Gutierrez, and I. We get together every year at the beginning of the year to do like a reading type of thing. And I remember that this was in the early 1980s. Lucha came to Juan Pablo's home, and she said, "I have something for you, Francisco," and lay down on the floor, and she took me in, and I had this vision for 10 minutes in which I was translating from Nahuatl, but I kept saying, "It's not me, but I'm doing this," and then she felt exhausted when I said, "So what's the meaning of this?" She said, "I have no idea, you have to find out." And so it so happens that I got a Fulbright.
Okay.
I got a Fulbright when I was at Stanford to go to Mexico.
Okay.
And so I immediately went to a museum, the Museum of el Museo de Antropología Historia, and I encountered this manuscript written by Hernando Ruiz Alarcón.
Okay.
Okay, that's another
Sure.
as part of the
We'll talk
contract.
about snake points
and
later.
and that, I got into that.
Yeah.
And then when I was in the office of Gustavo Sáenz, who was director of Bellas Artes, the literary section of Bellas Artes in Mexico City, I found this poet who was coming from Cuba, who had just arrived from Cuba. He had been in Cuba, and we greeted each other, and I told him that I was using my Fulbright to go to Cuba. And I did go to Cuba.
Okay.
Okay. And so he said, "Oh, when you come back from Cuba, please come and visit me."
Okay.
In Guadalajara. And I said, "Oh, yes, of course."
And who was this poet?
Elias Andino.
Okay.
Elias Andino, who at that moment must have been about 82 years old, or so. And so when I came back from Cuba, I went to see him, and we became very good friends. I think.
Did you know from the very beginning that he was gay?
Of course, people knew.
Okay.
He was a survivor of the Contemporáneos. Los Contemporáneos is a group of writers that came out after the Mexican Revolution, 1910. This was, the revolution that 1 million people died and basically destroyed the economy and the cultural institutions of Mexico. So the Contemporáneos, like Javier Villarrutia, like Salvador Novo, Jorge Cuesta, and Gilberto Owen, and Elias Andino were the ones that were basically trying to rebuild the cultural institutions of Mexico.
So you came back and you met with him?
I met with him, and he invited me to his hometown, Cocula, and I became very much. And then the big thing that we had a lot of beautiful discussions, every day. That I spent days with him, and he basically was saying to me, "Francisco, look at yourself. You're young, you're gay, and you're in the closet. And here I am. I'm 80 years old. I'm recognized as a poet. I'm a doctor, and I have a literary project in Guadalajara, and nobody has problems with me." And so I basically, I was challenged, and so I came out in Cocula.
How old were you?
I was, I'm in the mid-20s, mid-20s.
So he was 80, in his early 80s,
Yeah.
and you were in your mid-20s,
20s.
and he was mentoring you.
Basically, totally. And so, and we did wonderful things together, wonderful things. And so he was, at that moment, he was recognized in Mexico because they had an international poetry festival in Morelia, in Michoacan. And they had invited Jorge Luis Borges as one of the keynote poets, and also Elias Andino. Well, Elias Andino stole the show because, he read homoerotic poetry, because he was in love with a person in Cocula. It was beautiful, beautiful poetry. So he was called the youngest poet of Mexico, 82-year-old Elias Andino. And so I was there when he was given then the highest honor in Mexico, the El Premio Nacional de Literatura. And I actually went, I was his companion to go with the National Palace.
You read with him?
No, I went with him
Okay.
to the National Palace, and the President of Mexico, Jose Luis Portillo, gave him the literary prize in front of Congress, in front of the Palacio Nacional, and then he came to the podium and he read his homoerotic poems. And I was there in the audience, and I said,
Yeah, what,
You know,
what were
I
you
mean, it's
thinking?
like, you know,
What were you
you
thinking?
think that would be possible in the White House with Ronald Reagan? I said, no. You know, how interesting
Yeah.
that a culture is supposed to be so machista.
Yeah.
You know, it's able, his person is able to liberate himself.
Uh-huh.
And so, and I remember I had a birthday party for him at my house at an apartment, and I invited every poet. And every poet came to my house in Mexico City. Okay, so I really got, and then we did special issues in Mexico of Chicano poetry. We did like 3 issues of the literary magazine. They
So even
mass distribution.
So even while you were in Mexico, on your Fulbright, you were also doing some editing.
Totally, all the time.
Okay.
All the time.
And you published some Chicano poets from the U.S. in the magazine in Mexico.
In Mexico.
What was the name of the magazine?
It's called Bellas Artes.
Bellas Artes, okay.
And they used to print out 500,000 copies. It was a tabloid type of thing, and it was free.
Who were some of the Chicano poets who you published in Bellas
Well,
Artes?
I think, you know, the same, you know, the group.
Your cohort.
You know,
Cohort,
I mean,
okay.
I remember that Victor Martinez. We had, I think we had Chiri Moraga. I think we had Ana Castillo.
Okay.
I think we had Lucha Corpi and Rona D.
So
Gary Soto.
were these
and
poems, were they translated into Spanish?
yeah, you know, and the translators were Juan Felipe Herrera, myself, and also Ivonne Diablo Bejarano.
Okay, so you, Juan Felipe, and who was the third person?
Yvonne Diablo Bejarano, professor.
You were translating Chicano poets from English into Spanish to publish in Bellas Artes.
Precisely.
Do you remember how that work was received?
I think it was, you know, for a lot of people, it was an eye-opening, you know, for a lot of people, you know, they really thought it was interesting that we, you know, they did not understand a lot of things. But I think it was good.
Yeah.
It was good. It was very good. And we actually met a lot of the poets, and I went to a lot of conferences invited by Bellas Artes, and it was very good.
This was all this was during your Fulbright year.
Precisely.
During your
Precisely.
Fulbright
And then
year, while you were a
at
student
the end,
Stanford.
at the end of the year, and I took courses with, you know, with Carlos Monsiváis also, in La UNAM, and then at the end of the year they give a prize. They give a prize to the best Fulbright, who had the most impact. And I was the one that got the prize from the embassy.
Wow.
And of course, they knew that I had gone to Cuba, but I think that was no problem. You know?
So let me get this straight. So you were on your Fulbright. Your official Fulbright was supposed to be a year in Mexico, but you took part of that time to go to Cuba.
Just to visit.
Just to visit.
Okay.
Okay.
And so when I came back from Mexico, I was excited. And that's how the Socials, you know, was formed. And then, you know, and that's how we did the first publication of gay Chicanos.
And that was Llama
Carnal.
Okay.
And I remember I saw a play done by Rodrigo Reyes, Reunion. That was beautiful. It was so wonderful. It was a coming out story, and the Mission District.
And he wrote the play.
The play was written by a Filipino.
Okay.
You know, and the people that played in Herbert Sigüenza and Ricardo Salinas, who were part of Culture Clash, were the feature protagonists of that beautiful play.
I want to get back for a moment. So so we had Tattoos, and then you had Llama Carnal. Both of those titles, in my mind, seem to be emblematic of what we call small press publishing. And then, of course, you mentioned the many small presses that were, or magazines that were operating in the U.S. around that time. Can you begin to tell us a little bit about what the thinking was in that period, especially for Chicano Latino writers? Was it because small press publishing was the only options available for those writers? No one, I guess University of Arizona Press, though, Arte Público Press, did Arte Público and Bilingual Press exist then yet?
They did exist. You know, in terms of what bilingual review was, you know, La Revista Bilingüe Chicano-Riqueña was part of the literary circuit, and also there were other ones, and you know, and that's why I wanted to break away from the ghetto, and I remember that I sent poems to Ziziba. Ziziba was probably one of the best literary magazines in San Francisco, and I got published. You know,
well, that was like in the early '90s.
Jack Hunker, but that was that's how Cuerpo en Llamas came about.
Okay.
Because Cuerpo en Llamas, let me tell you, Cuerpo en Llamas, I had the manuscript of Cuerpo en Llamas. I was very influenced by my visits to Guadalajara, and as a child, I used to see El Hombre de Fuego in El Hospicio Cabañas, and we totally agree with Jose Clemente Orozco, his idea that, you know, artists have to basically become a torcha to give light, and that's what the collection is. You know, this Cuerpo en Llamas is also a return to the Mesoamerican tradition in so many ways. And so I sent the collection to Howard Junker, and then he told me that he was playing tennis with the owner of the Chronicle newspaper, and he mentioned that, oh, you know, I have a friend of mine who's a poet, and he has a collection of poems. You know, can I pass this poem collection? Oh yeah, send it to me. So he sends a collection to the Neon, who is the owner, Eboy, who is the owner of the Chronicle, and then I get a letter from Chronicle Book saying, oh, we would like for you to send us the manuscript.
Well, let's make sure we get this whole story, because this is where I can implicate myself. Okay, so in 1985 or so, 86, was when I went to a reading at Cody's bookstore. You were reading from the manuscript of Cuerpo en Llamas. This is now a little bit of a joint oral history. You were reading from that manuscript. I was, at the time, working for the Berkeley Poetry Review. I went up to you and I introduced myself. Afterwards, we went and we had coffee, and you began to read from Cuerpo en Llamas to me. And that's when I asked, can I translate some of these? And a few weeks later, you sent me the entire manuscript, and I began to translate some of the poems. I sent you the translations, and we sent a few to Howard Junker, and he accepted My Hair.
Yes,
that was the first translation he accepted, My Hair. And I think later he accepted another one, it might have been My Bed. And then it was around that time that he was encouraging you to submit the manuscript
to Chronicle Books.
You submitted it, and it was accepted. And it was right around that time that I was going off to Spain. So in other words, that was sort of when our paths crossed. And that was my first. Those translations was my first publication of any kind. Were translations.
Well, let me tell you, and so happened that Chronicle Books had never done poetry.
Yeah.
This was the first book of poetry that ever did, you know, and it was reviewed everywhere, and it was, you know, I think it had an impact, and so that was what influenced. And then, you know, the distribution was international, and so it got translated into Swedish.
And Irish as well.
And Gaelic also. Yeah. And that was the connection with that. And then came this is, 1992, the 500 years of Columbus' arrival to America.
But before we get to snake poems, I want to get back a little bit, because I want to make sure we discuss this. I think it's very important. Because so during that period of time, Arte Publico Press existed, and bilingual press existed. They were doing books, bilingual. I would, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's fair to say that during that period of time, if you wanted to publish a book, Arte Publico Press was a possibility, and bilingual press was a possibility. So can you explain why, I mean, obviously, Cuerpo en Llamas went with Chronicle Books because you had the relationship with Howard. That was that connection. But did you aspire to perhaps try to publish a book with an Arte Publico Press or bilingual press? And if not, why not?
Well, I do think there is, I think poetry is not that simple. And poetry is difficult to publish, I think.
Yeah, okay.
And there's a lot of biases against poetry. That poetry doesn't sell. And I write mostly in Spanish, and I was writing mostly in Spanish, and so even that, it was sort of a limiting. I did not send a collection of poetry to Arte Publico Press. I did send poems for their literary magazine. I think I was published in Chicano Riqueña, and also published in the Americas Review. And I think in Bilingual Press also. I think I was published in both the magazines. The magazines. Okay. But not as a practice. Because, I was so true. I was very much involved with the Chicano Latino Writer Center, because I became basically the head of that, and then we basically got exhausted at one point, because we were doing readings all over the state, and then at one point we decided not to do this anymore, because we were spending too much time doing readings in communities, and taking a lot of our time. And so we decided to do that no longer.
Yeah.
And then we decided at one point as a group, we had meetings and said, what do we see? And it was very conscious. There were different issues that were happening in the community. AIDS became a crisis situation. And as a writer, I also became involved with the first Latino AIDS project. It was called Quas. And Quas also took a lot of our time. And Rodrigo Reyes did a film, a video, educating the community. And from Felipe, Juan Pablo Gutierrez wrote a grant. We got $100,000. For the first grant ever done for a Latino AIDS project, and it was the idea, and that we had to deal with that issue.
And what was your charge with that money? What did you?
Well, it was to educate the community. We did a film, we did brochures. We used to have workshops. And Marco Rodriguez was basically a health educator, and we were, that was a lot of our time was spent dealing with the crisis situation, and so I remember, this was something that it was every day in our lives. What was going to happen to our community? I lost basically all my friends in this crisis. All my friends that I had in the Mission District, they all basically disappeared in a period of time. And I remember that I went to Rodrigo's basically pad. It was my place before in San Francisco when he passed. And, people were gathering there crying and didn't know what to do. And I came in and I saw him and I was so sad. On my bed, basically, I had been in my bed. And people said, well, you have to call, let's call a priest. And I said, but, Rodrigo, I was rejected. And so why don't we do our own project here? So I empowered myself to do an invocation in the Nahuatl tradition, and so I became almost like the priest of death for a lot of my friends. And so that was the beginning, I think, also of the procession, of the ritual procession that we've done now for 30 years in San Francisco. Juan Pablo Gutierrez is the one that heads that, and so that was important. And so I did also, at that moment, I was able then to finish Snake Poems. The invocation, I said it to Chronicle
Let's
books.
transition to Snake Poems, because we're beginning to sort of wind down with our time, and I want to make sure we get to some other topics. So I'd like you to talk to me about Snake Poems and what it meant for that book to be published.
Well, Snake Poems, I really believe that poetry is magical, and that somehow, I had to do that to redeem my ancestor, Hernando Ruiz Alarcon, who basically did horrible things to the Indians for 10 years in Mexico, 100 years after the conquest. I went to the museum, I saw the manuscript, and I was very moved, and I'm not an anthropologist, I'm a poet, and so I decided to write poems in response to that manuscript, and that's how the Snake Poems came about.
And it was a trilingual book, right?
It has poems in Spanish, and the majority is in English, and also poems in Nahuatl. The Nahuatl comes from the manuscript, El Tratado de las Supersticiones de los Indios Naturales de la Nueva España. It was, basically done in 1629, but was never really published. There was a facsimile done at the end of the Porfiriato in 1898. But that was basically just
just to situate things. So Snake Poems was published in 1992. And if I remember correctly, 1992 was when you went from Santa Cruz to UC Davis.
Precisely.
How many years were you teaching at UC Santa Cruz, just for the record?
I think it was. I was there for 7 years.
You were there for 7 years, and you had a community as well.
Precisely.
Tell us about the community at UC Santa Cruz.
It was very active. I became much involved with the Women's Center. That's how I became very much a good friend of Edwin Rich. And we used to get together. She used to come to my house, and we had readings in my house, and she used to be very active. It was so wonderful. And every time that I invite her to come and read, she will come and read, and I would go to her house. We had dinners with Javier, and also my partner, and it was a wonderful relationship that we had.
Lorna was
actually my house partner. We were house.
And she was there because she was a graduate student there.
She was in the PhD program, and I became also a good friend of Gloria Saldúa.
During that period.
Yes, and Gloria Saldúa is the one that basically encouraged me to become an author for writers for children.
Oh, really?
And we got together, I remember. And
That's good to know. So Gloria Azadua is the one who actually encouraged you to do writing for children.
Well,
Okay.
because she had done one book with Chilo Book Press in San Francisco, and I was very happy. And then I became aware of those books, and they had beautiful books, basically mythological books. Malaquias Montoya had a beautiful book of mythology, and then they had books, but the Spanish was kind of weird, And I wrote a letter to the editor. I said, I love your books, but the Spanish is kind of weird. Like, I give you an example. One kid, a Latino from California, was saying, me comí las judías. And I go, in California Spanish, that means, I ate the Jewish women. And that cannot be.
Yeah.
I know that you mean los frijoles.
Yeah.
Los frijoles. But that doesn't. And so she confessed to me and said, "Oh, I have a translator in Madrid." And I go, "Yeah, well, that doesn't help. That doesn't help." And then she said, "Can you help us?" Yes. So I became basically a consultant, and then I was doing too much of a correction, so I became a translator. And then I said, why don't we now encourage U.S. Latinos to get involved with this project?
Yeah.
And so then I got everybody involved.
Including Gary Soto, or no?
No, Gary Soto was doing his own thing.
Okay.
But we got Juan Felipe Herrera, we got Gloria Azadua. I was the translator of Gloria Azadua. I was the editor of all the books that Juan Felipe Herrera published at the beginning. I was the editor, and I was the translator.
And Jorge Argueta, too, right?
And I became also the editor of Jorge Argueta, and Luis Rodriguez, and Lucha Corpi. So I got everybody involved in this project. Gary Soto was not, let me tell you, I have to say this, was not encouraging us to do this.
But I have this memory that didn't he once convene a meeting where he wanted? Tell us about that meeting.
That was a chapter.
Yeah.
It's a chapter that is still in my
In the
mind.
story, yeah.
It's still in my mind because he convened a meeting to his house. All the escritores were in.
Yeah.
Juan Felipe was there, Lucha Corpe was there, and Victor Martinez. Everybody was there. Francisco Santana, and we were there. And we thought, and we had discussed that we wanted to become, authors for children, basically,
Yeah.
to do children's books. And basically, his message to us was, "Don't get involved with this. This is my turf."
So he felt a little.
He felt totally threatened.
He felt a little territorial.
Totally.
Okay.
And when my first book came out, Laughing Tomatoes, he would not speak to me because we were invited to different conferences, and I remember that we had a panel, the International Reading Association, and they had given us a prize, and he was also one of the award-winning books, and I was given the same thing, the same honor, and he would not speak to me. Later on, he came around. But I think it was important for us to do that, to publish. And now I have to say, it's a body of literature for children in English and Spanish, and I think that's very good.
Yeah. I want to wind this down, and I want to talk. So in 2002, your new and selected poems came out, From the Other Side of Night. You moved to UC Davis in 1992. But I want to spend our last 5 or 10 minutes talking about the Facebook page that you started. Tell us that story and how that experience of the Facebook page has influenced your vision for how poetry is being disseminated currently, and how that affects your own work.
Well,
Tell us the story.
I'm a late bloomer in terms of the use of the social media, and let me tell you this. It happened in a way that was even beyond my control. Manuel Hernandez, who was also a poet and also now was a critic from Stanford, was teaching at University of Arizona State, and so he basically sent me a YouTube video where the arrest of 9 Latino Chicano students who were arrested because they were protesting SB 1070. I was very moved.
Tell us what SB 1070 is.
It's a law against, basically a very anti-immigrant, xenophobic law.
From what
that
state?
Basically from Arizona.
Okay.
And so they were in Phoenix. They had basically chained themselves to the doors of the state capitol. And for me, it was very Gandhi-like, very Martin Luther King action.
Yeah.
And so I was very moved. And so I wrote a poem immediate. And then I sent the poem to Manuel. Manuel. Manuel took the poem to city jail where they were, the 9 students, and so they sent me, they were sending me messages.
Yeah.
So I was saying, well, this is what life is all about.
Yeah.
Here they are in jail. I wrote a poem. They the same day they write back. So I said, I better share this. I'm gonna open up a Facebook page, and I did. I opened a Facebook page. I called it Poets Responding to SB 1070. That was May 1st of 2010, 4 years ago, and the response was immediate. I had hundreds of people
sending you poems.
Basically responding to the poem and responding to this, and then it became overwhelming. I said, so I invited all the poets to be moderators of this page. Well, one of the first ones was Alma Villanueva. Okay. Another was Odilia Galvan Rodriguez, and then I went to Tucson to deal with the issue, and Elena Diaz Borges was also part. Andrea Hernandez Holmes also, and now Carmen Calatayud is now part of that, and also the other poets have been involved. Lona Di Cervantes
they
was
became
at one
sort of like
point.
co-curators for you.
Basically, no, they were actually moderating, putting poems, and it so happened that sometimes we got 500,000 hits in a month. So it was very interesting that we got poems from all over, from Spain, from India, from all over the States, in English, Spanish, and it was just a blooming. It became an open forum, basically, for poetry. And I think, to me, it was very empowering, because at the end, I really believe this is a way of going back to the old tradition. Because here you have the poet, like myself, who can then write a poem. I can put it on Facebook, and then, like, I did a poem. I went to see this wonderful play, Black Wedding, and I put yesterday the poem. El otro día me encontré a García Lorca. The other day I ran into García Lorca that you translated, and I put it on Facebook. And I bet you right now there must have been about 250 people that have read and seen the poem. So to me, that is an engagement that I think social media allows the writer, and when sometimes I have 2,000 people viewing the page and view the poem. How many books we have to publish in order to get 60,000 readers? I mean, it would be impossible. And so I think this is a way, I will say, an extension. I'll say Facebook has become, for me, it's been an extension of my own soul, because other people can share my view, and I can also see their reaction. I can read also other people's poems, and we can engage in this discourse that it goes back to the old tradition. I remember as a kid listening to my grandparents, and it was a direct communication. They would say something, and I could then make a comment. Pero abuelito, what about this? You told us about this. The same thing, I could write a poem, and somebody says, somebody actually said today in a comment, said, I remember that you read that poem and to our class, and we discussed the meaning of that, and people were then aware, and I immediately saw that, that there was something there, and then that I was gay. That was, they had discussed that, and he had the right view of myself, and that was a comment that he posted today on Facebook, and I think that's great. That's great, because I think that's precisely what the social media does.
But that page also began to collaborate with La Bloga, right?
Precisely. And so when Michael Serrano, who is the editor of the Bloga on Tuesdays, then we became aware because we went to the commemoration of Floricanto USC in University of Southern California, and basically we then said, we're going to select poems from our weekly postings. So then we were doing weekly Floricantos, and we had sometimes 50 poems in a week, and we got to select the poems, and a lot of those poets, actually we encourage a lot of those poets to continue publishing.
Yeah.
And people like Sonia Gutierrez was very active.
Yeah.
Now she has her own book published, and other writers, that have really Gerardo Pacheco.
Yeah.
So it's a young poet that was very active at the beginning, and now he's doing his own book, and so it's fantastic.
We're going to wind this down by having you speak very briefly about your two new books forthcoming in 2014. One is called Borderless Butterflies, and the other is called Canto Hondo. Can you briefly just tell us about those two projects, and that will wind down the interview.
Well, Borderless Butterflies, Las Mariposas Sin Frontera, is, I think, the result of this engagement with Facebook. I do post a poem almost every day, and the idea I wanted to experiment. How far can I take this medium? And so I would post they're basically haigas. Haigas are haiku. They're 3 lines. The ideal haiku is 7 syllables. 5 syllables for the first line, 7 syllables for the second line, and 5 syllables for the last line. In Spanish, it works very nice. English, because it's monosyllabic, it's a lot more difficult to do that, but that's fine. And so I would put an image also together with the poem, and get really thousands of people responding to the page. And so a friend of mine, a Facebook friend that I finally met last week, sent me a note saying, "Will you consider doing a book with us? Send us your manuscript." So I did send. To me, it was a tour de force because I did this in no time during the break. I teach full time. I'm very busy, and I was able to finish, and I sent it to the collection. So it happened that they chose the collection. So it's coming out at the end of this year.
Okay.
And I think, to me, is the idea of eco-poetics, and going back to the issue of the butterfly as a migrant insect that goes through the border and comes back 4 generations later, and basically they're disappearing. They are now in a critical situation.
And tell me the name of the press who's doing this?
This is a Poetic Matrix Press, and they're based in Madera in California. And so that to me is a very dear project because it has to do with the idea of the butterfly. It has to do with immigration reform. It has to do also the idea of writing. One of the main topics is about the issue of writing. What is poetry and what's a poet? And the issue also of how can we respond to social events? And then the last collection, Canto Hondo, Deep Song. That is a very, it's been a really long time.
Yeah.
And I think that is a continuation of the project of Cuerpo en Llamas. Cuerpo en Llamas is the idea of the body that we have to reclaim ourselves. Now, I'm very much taken by Garcia Lorca, the Cante Hondo, the idea of the gypsy as being the other. The lowest of the law in Spain, they've been discriminated against. They are the people that people basically sometimes spit because they're outcasts in society. And here I am in America in the year 2014, and who are the gypsies of America? Well, the people have no papers. They're undocumented. Then my compatriotas, and so that's this.
And that book is being done by University of Arizona.
That will be published at the end of this year, the University of Arizona Press, and we also have I really hope that the end of the year. We'll have also an announcement that we will do, the collection called Poetry of Resistance, an anthology in response to SB 1070, and we have about 70 poets, reading.
Okay, we're going to wind this interview down. I'm going to ask you to read Fugitive, and that will conclude the interview.
Well, this is a poem. Let me tell you, this is a poem that was published by Juan Felipe Herrera.
Great.
In Red Trapeze. It was a broadside that he did that. He got me a job at the national park, the Golden Gate National Park, in Alcatraz one summer. He was the one because he was working there, and that was a summer job. So he had a job, and I had nightmares. At the end, I had to quit because I saw myself in jail, and I wrote this poem,
Okay.
and he actually published a poem, and it so happens that it was almost like a prophecy, because I think a few weeks after the published poem, I was living the reality of this
Okay.
poem. I read it both in English and Spanish.
Okay,
It says,
okay.
fugitivo.
And with that, we'll end the interview.
He tenido que soportar los días anónimo, como sombra, escurrirme por la ciudad sin causar sospecha. He rodeado innumerables caminos, saltado cada cerca huyendo, siempre con una prisa que me muerde los talones y apenas me deja respirar, ocultándome tras tantas quimeras durante tantos años que ahora ya ni distingo el rostro de mi alma, ni recuerdo qué me llevó a esta vida de prófugo. Mi crimen debe haber sido enorme como la oscuridad que acarrea mi pena. Ante todo, he procurado la compañía muda de la noche. He aprendido a disimular casi todo, pero todavía me delata junto a ti el desbocado palpitar de mi corazón. Fugitive, I had to bear the days anonymously. Like a shadow, slipped through the city without raising suspicions. I've avoided countless roads, jumped every fence I was fleeing, with a haste that bites my heels and barely lets me breathe, hiding behind so many illusions for so many years that now I don't even recognize the face of my soul, nor recall what brought me to this fugitive life. My crime must have been as huge as the darkness found in my punishment. Above all, I sought the new company of night. I learned to fake nearly everything. But still, when I'm next to you, I'm given away by the empty pounding of my heart.
Thank you so much for spending this time with us. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.